this in terms of actually counting optical scan ballots, it's really fast. It doesn't take much time. There's a whole scenario. A lot of the speculation here has to do with the concern that, well, on election day, the Democrats are voting by mail and Republicans are going to show up on election day and the results are going to differ and Trump's going to declare victory and then it's going to be all kinds of battles about counting the remaining ballots. It is, this is an extraordinary time, and it's extraordinary. We are seeing an extraordinary, unprecedented amount of mail-in balloting. That being said, first of all, early vote is different. Early vote is not mail-in. Early vote, they count the same way they do on election day. It's a ballot, goes in a box, it's sitting there in the stack with the same ones from election day, and it goes through the machine, 1,000 a minute. The assumptions about the composition of the electorate, I would also view with some skepticism. Yeah, it's possible. The numbers could be such it'll make a difference, but our experience is that a lot of our voters, and I should talk about the Democratic Party, African-American, Latino, low-income voters don't like to vote by mail. They tend to vote on election day and early vote. And that, that cuts against the assumptions that people make about this. And then finally, I'll just say that, there's a difference between we want every vote counted, everybody's vote should be counted, but there's a difference between counting every vote and knowing who won. And the reason is that when you have a certain universe, let's say of mail-in ballots that have been counted, and you know what that is, there's no reason to believe that as a matter of, random statistical probability, the remaining ones are going to break significantly differently unless something happened in the, and that's changed the nature of the race and, in a matter of days. And we're not seeing that. And this is something, and I know Charlie's been this through, every lawyer that's done recounts is to tell their clients says, wow, I have 100, my opponent has 103,000 votes and I have 100,000. There's 50,000 votes left to be counted, mail and provisional. I could win. No, you're not going to win because it has to break in such opposite proportions from the rest of the vote to make up the difference. But anyway, with that, I'll stop and let Charlie give his view. But I think, again, we're all prepared. Without a doubt, everybody should vote. Vote early if you can. Vote early in person if you can. If you can't, mail your ballot in early. Should everyone do that? Absolutely. Is this going to be World War III and the greatest constitutional crisis we've ever seen? Don't count on it.
Well, this is kind of unfortunate because I think I agree with everything Joe said. And that always worries me. But I'm going to make a few high-level points that I suspect Joe may not agree with, but I'm just going to do it from a high level, and they may prompt conversations or questions over the next, 45 minutes. So as a starting point, I firmly believe that all Americans have the right to vote easily, fairly, and without dilution of their vote by fraudulent votes. To be very clear, there is an easy way to vote right now. Despite what you hear in the news, for centuries, people have gone to their polling places and they're restricted by how many people can go to them. They're local, they're in your neighborhoods, and those haven't gone away. So voting on election day is still there. And probably half of Americans are going to, I don't know the exact numbers, but probably half of the people that vote will do so on election day. And then there's a lot of consternation in the press about these drop boxes or where you can go early and vote. But I would also remind people that almost every American has this neat little thing. It's called a mailbox. And it's outside their door. And they can put their ballot in that. I encourage you to do it early if you're doing it, so there's time to process it, but you don't need to do a drop box. You can vote by mail, and there's a convenient location to mail it. So just with that being said up front, I want to make 3 or 4 quick legal topic points and 1 political point. On the legal topics, first of all, vote fraud is real. If you don't believe that, go to the Heritage Foundation website where they catalog over 1,400 cases of vote fraud. Or if you want case studies and have an hour or two to buy me a drink, I'll tell you about the first election challenge I was involved in with Mary Landers' Senate race in Louisiana and the vote fraud there. Or if you want a more recent example, just in 2018, in the last election cycle, look at North Carolina's 9th congressional district, where one candidate won by 905 votes, which is a margin of, 0.3% of the ballots cast. But the state's Board of Election wouldn't certify the results because, quote, there were concerted fraudulent activities related to absentee by mail ballots, including illegal vote harvesting by a political consultant. So that's an example. And by the way, that election ended up being overturned and a new election was called. So that's just in 2018. So I'm not saying there's systemic vote fraud across the country, and I'm not saying that it is going to impact the presidential election, because I think that's extraordinarily unlikely unless you hit that crazy scenario Joe talked about it all coming down to one state. But when we Republicans have concerns about it, it is legitimate. And the next point is, I believe that newly instituted voting by mail without protections increases the risk of vote fraud. I think there are some states, Washington, Colorado, et cetera, that have had years to perfect voting by mail and run it pretty well. But if we're, as a result of COVID, going to mandate vote by mail in states that have never done it before, I do think we're going to have issues pop up in terms of the counting of ballots and also in terms of the risk of fraud. The next point I want to make is that outrage surrounding elections tends to be situational. And what I mean by that is, in September of 2016, you may recall the last presidential election, Donald Trump started to call into question the results of the election. And in September of 2016, he said that if he loses, it's going to be because the election was stolen from him and because of everybody wrung their hands, said this is outrageous, it's an affront to democracy. I remember Hillary Clinton's lawyer, Joe and I's mutual friend, Mark Elias, was really pressuring Republican lawyers to weigh in. Those of us that, so I was not on the Trump team. I had been working with Jeb Bush. So those of us that were not on the Trump team, they were pushing to weigh in and say, elections won't be stolen. We should validate the integrity of elections. And I did that. A lot of Republican lawyers did that and said, you can trust the system. Then, lo and behold, on election day, Donald Trump wins. And, who knew? Donald Trump wins. And then all of a sudden, it's Democrats calling into question the integrity of the election and the validation of the results. And that is so much true that even as late as March of 2019, Hillary Clinton was talking about the vote in Wisconsin, saying that was stolen from her. And after the election in 2016, Jill Stein, the third-party candidate, was challenging the results, but she was using Team Hillary lawyers to do it. So a lot of this outrage you hear matters who's winning and who's losing. Another topic I'd like to touch on is voter suppression and myths surrounding that. But so that I don't hog all the time, I'd like to touch briefly on a political point, which since we have I know this is a nonpartisan organization, but since we have Republicans and Democrats here, I'd like to note that elections are choices. And Donald Trump is not my ideal candidate. I worked for Mitt Romney and I worked for Jeb Bush. I didn't pick Donald Trump, but he is the choice we as Republicans have. And in front of an audience of Jewish attorneys, I want to note that Donald Trump has been a wonderful surprise in terms of his support for the Jewish community and his unwavering support for the state of Israel. He has been fantastic, and he's made more progress on peace in the Middle East and protecting the state of Israel than I've seen any president do in my lifetime. And I'm, very happy and impressed by that. With that being said, I'm guessing Joe might disagree on a few points.
Yeah, I think rather than maybe debate all that, the last point particularly is one that drives me nuts. The idea that this, Kushner, who can't recite the alphabet, comes from a family of crooks, is a great diplomat and delivered these things, and that redeems everything Trump's done to destroy the country, and everything that undergirds Jewish values just makes me nuts. So anyway, that's the only one I'll respond to. I think we can move on to questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Joe and Charlie. Obviously differences of opinion, but that's why we're here. So let's get started. We do have a number of questions as I anticipated and hoped. So let me see where to begin. Okay, so Paul Friedman, and I do say that if Joe or Charlie, choose to are answering a question and the person who has asked the question would like to respond and ask a follow-up, I believe that should be okay as long as Joe and Charlie don't mind.
Sure.
Just try to let everybody finish their thoughts and sentences. So we have Paul Friedman, who I'm not exactly sure, Paul, what the question is, but you mentioned that polling places have gone away, especially in minority and college areas. Voting rolls have been improperly purged, and the Supreme Court ensured many mailed votes won't be counted in Wisconsin. Since I don't exactly see the question, but Jen Kaufman did ask something along those lines of, can you unpack what happened in Wisconsin? So maybe we can go from there and discuss Wisconsin. Whoever would like to discuss that or start.
Well, the courts have not, uniformly pretty much federal courts have mostly, rejected efforts to force, where state law says that a mail-in ballot has to be in by a certain time, and somebody's brought a suit to say it's a constitutional matter because of the pandemic, the court should extend the time otherwise provided by state law. Virtually none of those cases have been won, and we had that in the ballot with the ballot initiatives earlier in this cycle. Same pattern. What happened, in Wisconsin is the federal court agreed with that argument, and the Supreme Court rejected it just now, yesterday, based on, in large part, what we call the Purcell principle. There's a doctrine in the law that the federal courts should not change the election rules too close to the election. So while there's a lot of issues involved here, that particular result was not surprising. Is it unfortunate? Yeah. What are we as Democrats going to do about it? Just what our great Democratic Party Wisconsin chair, Ben Wickler, announced yesterday, which is just an all-out effort to educate voters when to get their ballots.
That's a reasonable response to educate people, and I would just add that along with the Purcell principle, which the court has indicated over the past few weeks they're going to be strictly applying, to flesh that out a bit, Justice Gorsuch eloquently talked about how the Constitution provides the state legislatures not federal judges and not state judges or state governors, bear the responsibility for setting election rules. So if people don't like the system that their state has, change the law, but don't have an unelected judge do it at the last minute.
All right. Thank you to Joe and Charlie for that. So we'll move on to the next question. Rhonda asked if you guys could talk about the changing demographics from 2016 to today and how that might affect the election. Maybe Charlie, you want to start this?
Honestly, as a lawyer, I tend to defer to far smarter political operatives on things like demographics. So if Joe has thoughts on this, I'll defer to him on it. I would say at a very high level, Republicans have a problem in demographics. We've always in the past relied on older voters and have not done well with younger voters and with African American voters, and less so with Hispanic voters, with some notable exceptions of some states where some governors actually did win, Republicans have won the majority of the Hispanic vote. So that's winnable. But I think talking about drawing too many conclusions today, a week before the election, may be a little premature. At the moment, polling is showing that President Trump is actually doing better than Republicans usually do with Hispanic voters, and that's perhaps put New Mexico into play, and it's meaning that in Florida, some of the South Florida Hispanic vote is not only helping President Trump, but also gives Republicans the best chance of a House seat pickup in the Miami area. And also there's some indication that President Trump may be getting an uptick in support by African American males. But I'll believe this all after the election when we see what actually happened. Joe?
So ultimately demographics is destiny, and the Republican Party has a big problem in that regard, but that can take a long time to roll out. What matters for this election is the composition of the electorate. I mean, the African American community is overwhelmingly opposed to President Trump. The young people, 18 to 25, overwhelmingly opposed to President Trump. The percentage of those, the total universe of those who vote that's composed of young people is a tremendously important factor in this election. And so, for example, in Texas, we've seen that the composition of the 4.5 million people that voted in Texas is like 10% young people versus 7.5% from 2016. If that were true across the country, that factor alone would do it. So demographics long-term, matters. Changes in demographics. Who shows up is what this one's about.
Excellent. Thanks so much to both of you. And thank you to Rhonda for that great question. So next we are going to move on to Richard Huberman. So Richard asks, I would like Charles to respond to two recent op-ed columns former Republican election counsel Ben Ginsburg wrote in the Post, pointing out that Trump's claims about the fraud were greatly overstated. I would also note that the 2018 North Carolina fraud was perpetrated by a Republican candidate.
Yeah, good point.
Not necessarily a relevant point. If we're talking about the issue, and Ben's a friend, and I usually agree with him on things. And right after that column, he also got himself a CNN analyst deal, so I think it worked well for him. But to say that President Trump greatly overstated something is kind of a truism. I don't care what it is. So that's not really a surprise that he uses over-the-top rhetoric.
Okay. Do we have anything else on that, or would we like to move on? All right. So Steve Sherman would like to ask about the accuracy of polling. I'm sure that's something everybody wants to know about. He says, I know that electoral wins are based upon state results. They were off in 2016. Has the modeling of polling changed? Whoever wants to get started, feel free.
It's a complicated question. So any one poll is not going to be very good at, predicting the future. And the reason is because, I'll just to give you an example, the plain sort of vanilla nationwide poll for presidential, if you have a truly random sample of a universe, and that matters what that is, and of like 800, 900 people, and you ask, if the election were held tomorrow, who would you vote for, Biden or Trump? The percentage of people who say either one, taking each of those individually, if you replicated that same sample 100 times, not the same sample, but another 100 different totally random samples of that same universe 100 times, 95 times out of 100, the person, those numbers each would be the same within about 3.5 points. When you put it together, that one poll, if you look at the lead, it's like 14, it could be 7 points for either one of them. So it can be way off. And it's what people, and the other thing, people would say the same thing. It doesn't mean they'll do the same thing. And then there's the universe. It wasn't really people who are going to turn out to vote. You ask people, they say, yeah, I'm going to vote. But unless it's really done off a voter file where you can tell what people have a record, it's not that reliable. That being said, there's a couple points that should be noted. Polling in terms of those universes is a lot better now than 2016. Pollsters have learned to do effective online samples, and they've also learned to do get people with cell phones and make it a lot more universe. And there's a lot more polling off of voter files where you're pretty sure somebody says they're going to vote, that they are going to vote. The other thing to note is that while no one poll is, likely to tell you the direction, if you've got 4 or 5 polls that are really done by reliable pollsters, with the proper methodology, and they're all pointing in the same direction, even though with different numbers, the likelihood, as a matter of statistical probability, that the results in another direction, not so great. So anyway, it's complicated, complicated question. But the bottom line is, don't put your faith in polls.
The only thing I'd like to emphasize on that, I agree with everything Joe said, but I would emphasize what he said about national polls. If you are, trying to track, especially the presidential race, based upon national polls, especially those that are not of likely voters that were being used up until about when they switched over in late August, these are absolutely relevant to the pathway to the presidency. You're looking at probably 5 or 6 battleground states, or at least President Trump hopes you are. If the battlefield expands beyond that too much, then I think that's probably not a good thing for his narrow pathway.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Charlie and Joe. So we're going to move on to let's see. Okay, Jen Carol Kaufman asks, what will happen if the December deadline isn't met? If you could go through the steps vis-a-vis the electors, the governors, and the Supreme Court. That would be great. A lot of steps, I imagine. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, different scenarios. I mean, if a state didn't pick its electors by the 8th, the issue is could the state legislature, could appoint a slate of electors. In theory, yes, the idea that state legislators are going to go against the popular vote in their state, when they have to run for election the next time, seems pretty far-fetched to me. But if that happened, and you've got in a bunch of these states, battleground states with Republican legislatures have Democratic governors that could veto that, that could go to the courts. It's complicated. It could go in a lot of different directions. If there were competing slates of electors, if the ballots are counted late, and one, Trump won one, and the state legislature appointed electors for Trump, and Biden won the popular vote in that state, and there were competing slates of electors that would go to the U.S. House. If again, and it would only make a difference if that one state was the whole ballgame. Charlie, other scenario, there's been so much speculation by our friends in the academic community about we could spin out these scenarios for another 2 hours.
Charlie, do you have anything else you'd like to add, or?
Not on that, but as we're sort of spinning out scenarios, I think it could be helpful to mention what the outstanding court cases we're looking at, or the recent court cases are regarding the voting of ballots. And I would just note that there's about 5 relevant cases that I'm paying close attention to right now. The first was the Republican Party of Pennsylvania. And for that, the Supreme Court denied cert, which means that Pennsylvania is now allowed to count ballots up to 3 days after the election. So if the election hinges on Pennsylvania, that means we're going to have a little bit of a lag before knowing what happened. The next case is DNC versus Bostelman. That's the one we just talked about, where the Supreme Court yesterday upheld Wisconsin law that requires absentee ballots to be in by the time polls close on election day. The third is Middleton v. Adino, which is where the Supreme Court blocked implementation of an order waiving witness signature requirements. Fourth case, and there's 5 total. Fourth is more v. Surcosta, which is pending Supreme Court granting of cert at the Supreme Court. That's a challenge to a consent decree that allows North Carolina to count ballots up to 9 days after the election. And that's one that a lot of people are waiting to see if Justice Barrett is involved in. And then the final case, which is not going to, it's Arizona Republican Party v. DNC and Berdovich. These cases involve Arizona law, one which requires votes that are cast in the wrong direction to be tossed. And the other involves regulations of who can handle absentee ballots, or ballot harvesting is sort of the vernacular for that. And those cases are both pending before the Supreme Court.
All right. Thank you. Very thorough, and I'm sure you could definitely add more, but we do have plenty of more questions. And we do have a comment from Deborah about a piece on pro-Israel voters, if you guys want to take a look in the chat. And I just, of course, a huge part of the AJLJ and our mission is Israel advocacy. So it obviously is important for everybody to really look into, the candidates' policies and potential policies regarding Trump, regarding Israel. Sorry about that. So, anything that you guys can want to add if people are interested, although I'm going to move on to the next question. But again, the AJLJ's mission is supporting Israel, no matter how you choose to do it. So I think that's important. Thank you, Deborah, for drawing our attention, and we welcome all perspectives. So then we have...
Alyssa, can I just add that this is a piece by an American who's been living, an American physician who's been living for many years in in Israel who normally votes kind of right of center. And it's a piece about why she thinks pro-Israel voters should be voting for Biden this time.
All right.
And
Thank you.
it's well done.
Okay. So anybody who is interested in that, so you may see on the side in the chat. Sorry, next I have a really important question. Apologies for the phone in the background from Ariel Glasner. And let's see. What specific legal issues or challenges are election lawyers preparing for now to raise with the courts after the election?
That's what I want to hear.
Raise with the courts after the election is going to depend on what, whether it, right after the election is going to depend on whether it matters. What the issues are that matter in that state. It could be about grounds for rejecting vote by mail ballots, if they're grounds that cut through a vast swath of those so that it could make a difference in the outcome of a state. Certainly, and it's not just the presidential. I mean, there will be, there's always contests and sometimes recounts and sometimes contests for U.S. House races. And we have, of course, a number of very close Senate races. So all the issues that Charlie mentioned are, there. And then there are others that could, there's a whole range of them that could come up. Most of those, though, are probably, if it matters, are going to come down to essentially vote by mail, those vote by mail ballots that are counted, open, and disqualified in a particular state.
Okay.
So if you have been hearing the stories, I think Bob Bauer was, the large Democratic lawyer was on, I think it was Axios, talking about last week's, talking about the Democrat lawyers' preparations and saying that he's got thousands of lawyers ready to parachute out around the country and jets warmed up on the tarmac to get them the next day out to wherever there are problems. And I would say, from my perspective on the races I'm focused on preparing for Election Day, you want lawyers prepared and poll watchers to catalog what's going on, where there are any problems, where rules aren't being applied or aren't being applied fairly. So that's all an information gathering operation. In terms of what you're arguing, it is almost always situational. If your guy, on Election Day, what usually happens is some sort of left-leaning groups go into court by mid-afternoon on Election Day and argue that the rules should be changed and polling places should be kept open later in usually urban jurisdictions where there's a larger Democratic vote. So post Bush v. Gore, that was what usually happened on Election Day. And if Republicans were prepared and got into court and said, you can't just do, Bush v. Gore says there's an equal protection issue of different rules for different places in the same district. So if you're going to change the rules and keep a jurisdiction open, you've got to apply that fairly across the state. You can't do it just in some cities or precincts. So that we've seen that argument made. I fully expect that there will be those arguments made again with the pretext of COVID, saying that you need to extend the deadlines or extend the times with COVID thrown in as an overlay. And we've seen some state court judges, court of claims judges, who around the country have been willing to do that. So that's on Election Day. The day after, whether whatever you're arguing is almost certainly dependent upon whether your candidate is ahead or behind. So I don't mean to burst bubbles for anybody who think that one side's principled here and the other is not. I think most good election lawyers are able to make arguments on both sides of issues regarding whether certain, signature verifications, machine malfunctions, the sort of issues that if it's a very close House race or state level race might impact 20, 30, 40, 50 votes. Although not, as Joe pointed out at the very beginning, it's very hard to overturn an election these days. Post HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, which was passed after the Bush v. Gore decision in 2000, we now have electronic voting machines around the country, and it is hard to have systemic problems with electronic voting machines. You can have problems in certain precincts or with certain machines, but it is very rare that there is something that overturns the results of an election, especially once it's already been canvassed. So you have the votes come in, you have a canvass, and then you determine what somebody is going to do a recount. And I think it may take us a little longer getting to the results that get to the canvas this time, but it's unlikely that there are issues that change that result. Unless, of course, one of my clients is behind and they had the election stolen from them.
Right. Alyssa, you're on mute.
There was background noise, so I didn't even want to. Thank you to Joe and Charlie. So next we have Barry Good, who has asked, what do you think about Rosa Brooks' war game effort and the possibility of state legislatures designated different, quote unquote, certified electors?
Well, that's the issue we were talking about before, where, the deadline's missed and a Republican-led legislature takes advantage of it and tries to elect a slate of electors that goes against the popular vote. I think it'd be very, very difficult to pull off politically. I think you'd see people, in the streets. I think those state legislators that voted for it, their careers would be over. I mean, the idea of defeating the popular vote, is not, don't put anything past the Trump camp. But now we're talking about, and because they're capable of anything and don't observe any rule or norm whatsoever. But we're talking about state legislatures, and in a bunch of these in the battleground states, you also have Democratic governors who could veto it. So I think, the war games are important. Again, prepare for every scenario. Nobody wants to be like figuring this out after the fact in the unlikely event it happens. But the idea that this is going to come down to competing slates of electors in a state or more than one state that actually makes the difference for the whole thing seems to me, extraordinarily unlikely.
Charlie, do you have a response or?
Response is I agree.
Okay, great. That's a beautiful thing. So Richard still wants a response from you, Joe, as to the Ben Ginsburg op-eds.
Yeah. So, right, the issue of voter fraud. I mean, I would make 3 points about this. Actually, 2 points actually. So, when Charlie says, "Well, the Heritage Foundation found 1,400 cases of fraud over a period of years," you're talking about it's 1 billion votes cast. More than 1 billion for those 1,400. It's vanishingly insignificant. Secondly, the issue you have to connect the fraud that Republicans claim to the issue they're supposedly trying to address. And let's take voter ID. So, the idea that requiring an ID, the only kind of fraud it stops is when I go to the polls and I say, they'd say, "Who are you?" I'm Joe Sandler. I'm not, in fact, Joe Sandler. How often does that happen? Virtually never. You have to look far and wide for a case. And yet that's the whole rationale for all these difficult, voter ID requirements. We extend it to vote by mail. Trump is complaining, supposedly, you never know what the hell he's talking about, but to the extent you can figure it out, he seems to be complaining about mailing out of ballots where you don't have to request a mail-in ballot. It's just sent to you automatically, the way it is in Washington State and Colorado. Other than Colorado, that's not happening in any of the battleground states. So it's not even clear, what the issue is there. That, they're throwing ballots at the voters, and you never know who's going to fill it out. What difference does it make? It's not doing in any of the states we're talking about.
Right.
But it's not happening in a lot of states, not for lack of trying, but when awareness was raised about these proposals, they were then stopped.
Well, in most cases, the legislature would have to change it. So
I agree with that normally, and one would hope that was true. But earlier this year, you saw multiple, primarily Democratic governors, although not exclusively, governors trying to use COVID as a pretext for changing these rules and mailing ballots out to everyone, and that raised consternation, I think.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Joe and Charlie. Do you no further comments, or I think you covered that pretty well. And we have a few more questions. I know Paul and Steve had a couple more questions, but I actually also received a question via email from somebody who hasn't asked anything yet. I want to give everybody an opportunity. Enid Adler has asked, she said, yes, I do support Israel and covered the 1973 Yom Kippur War there as a journalist. That said, I must and do vote for what is best for my country, the U.S. Now, my question is concerned that American Jews vote for Trump only because he supports Israel. No American president has not been there for Israel. All right.
Say that. What was the end of that question?
So Enid wants to know, well, her concern is that American Jews vote for Trump only because he supports Israel. So I think she invites commentary on that.
Sure, I would disagree with her last statement that no American president has not. While that's true in terms of lip service, it's not true in terms of actions. And if you look at, whether it's Thomas Friedman or even the Washington Post and New York Times editorial pages, who of course loathe President Trump, have had to acknowledge his successes in the Middle East. And I realize, Joe made comments about not being a fan of Jared Kushner, but that being said, he's created far better results than the esteemed diplomats like John Kerry that Joe might prefer. So we've seen results out of this administration, and the comparison is either returning to the Obama-Biden policies of the Iran nuclear deal and sending bags of cash to the Iranian terrorists, or that's the moderate view. That assumes that Joe Biden's in charge. If Joe's not in charge, and Ilhan Omar, who yesterday said that she's going to be pushing him to the left, and the power base of the Democratic Party, which has been largely suppressed over the last month or two and kept silent so that they didn't hurt Biden in the general election. But if they reemerge with the BDS movement and a lot of the anti-Israel policies, it's going to be a really unfortunate situation.
So I obviously strongly disagree with that. Joe Biden was in the U.S. Senate for decades. There was no stronger supporter of Israel in all of those years than Joe Biden. The Obama administration, they're the ones that delivered Iron Dome. They were steadfast in the support of Israel. The idea that Iran, this myth about the bags of cash and the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, you can debate whether we're more secure now that Iran, is free to have nuclear weapons or not, and whether that actually makes Israel more secure. There are plenty of voices, and there was an article that I was just looking for from JTA about a very well-known Orthodox rabbi in Israel that powerfully makes the case for why Trump is a disaster for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. There's no shortage of voices on that side. To the extent there is, I am concerned. There's only 22%, according to the latest poll, the Jewish community supporting Trump, but that's too many, particularly if it's in Florida. So I do worry about it, and I hope people research the records and vote accordingly.
Thank you.
And I would just respectfully suggest that anybody who is predicting Trump not being good for Israel, go back and fact check what they said about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And I will bet anybody here that those people predicted that moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem was going to cause war in the Middle East and increase terrorism and awful things. And lo and behold, President Trump was correct. He did something that we've all talked about and everyone paid lip service to. He did it, and the Middle East didn't burn. In fact, we are almost indisputably in a better spot now.
All right. Thank you. So I'm going to end with a question from Arthur Traldi, because he has not asked a question yet. I know we do have a couple of other questions from Paul and Steve. Joe and Charlie, I'll follow up with you after. Maybe you'll have, I'll send you the questions. Maybe you'll have something to remark to them. That would be very much appreciated. But I'm going to end with Arthur's question. He said, I'm really interested in how you two perceive election lawyers on both sides might perceive how the litigation this year will affect us. Where polls say on both sides there are unusually high numbers of people who would be eager to accept any suggestion that the election was illegitimate. What do election lawyers do to help ensure a stable, peaceful resolution of issues in this environment?
That's a great question. I think the one thing Charlie and I share is a commitment to, to the process. I mean, basically, we think these things should be resolved in accordance with, established principles and institutions and the legal process. And we're all Jewish lawyers and jurists on this call. That's our common shared value. It's officers of the court and dedicated to the rule of law. And I think that's the contributions that election lawyers make in that area. And we share it across the aisle.
I agree with that. And I would suggest that look to, when you're seeing pundits on TV spouting off, if you're paying attention, if you care what they're saying, Google them and see what their experience is. And see if they're talking about election law or recounts or election integrity. See if they've ever actually done anything, or if they're just a pundit who happens to be a lawyer. And I think for those that are involved in the process, I certainly, respect Joe and enjoy our not all that frequent interactions, but in general, you'll find that most people get along, and as Joe said, share a commitment to the legal process.
Thank you. I think that is a perfect note to finish our questions on. Arthur, it's like it was planned. Thank you so much, Charlie and Joe. This has been excellent. Such a wonderful conversation. Again, I'll follow up with you too if you're willing to answer a couple more questions, but you're doing incredibly important work. Thank you so much from the AJLJ. And we actually do have, thank you to everybody for joining the AJLJ as well. We actually have on Thursday a special program It's with Michael Taylor, a Holocaust survivor, war veteran, war hero. So it'd be great if you guys could tune in. And join the AAJLJ. And I think I don't need to tell the people on this call to vote. I think if you're here, you probably are voting. So that is wonderful. And thank you again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days, and let's hope for a resolution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.